This plateau at Chittorgarh rises hundreds of feet into the air, walled off by a vertical rock face. It provided a natural high ground that the rulers of Mewar would spend centuries turning into a fortified stronghold. By the 14th century, the Delhi Sultanate was rapidly expanding across the Indian subcontinent. Most kingdoms were making alliances or paying tribute to the new power, but in the center of Rajputana, Mewar refused to submit. In 1303, that refusal brought the Sultan Ala-ud-Din Khilji and his army to the base of this cliff. He laid a grinding, months-long siege against Ratan Singh's capital. When the defenses finally began to buckle, the defenders chose a path of total sacrifice. They called it the Saka. The men donned saffron robes and rode out of the fortress gates to fight until the last man fell, a charge known as Kesariya. Inside the walls, the women, led by Queen Padmini, committed Jauhar, stepping into massive funeral pyres to ensure they were never captured. Khilji eventually entered a fortress filled with ash. He renamed the city Khizrabad after his son and left a governor in charge. To the outside world, Mewar had been liquidated. But the total destruction of the capital didn't end the resistance, it hardened it. The survivors who fled into the hills used the memory of that sacrifice to rebuild. They had proven that while their walls could be breached, the political will to remain independent remained intact. Over a century later, Mewar returned to the plains. The man responsible for this revival, Rana Kumbha, understood that the kingdom's survival required more than just bravery. It required massive engineering and a complex web of regional alliances. After defeating the forces of Malwa in 1437, Kumbha reconstructed the walls of Chittorgarh. He expanded the fortifications to cover the entire plateau, creating a massive stone footprint that broadcasted Mewar's military capacity to every neighboring rival. The 9 stories of the Vijay Stamb rise 122 feet above the fort. It was built as a victory marker, but it also proved that even after decades of warfare, Mewar possessed the artisans and treasury to build a monument of this scale. By the end of his reign, Kumbha had constructed 32 forts across his territory. He had transformed Mewar from a kingdom hiding in the hills into a regional superpower that could dictate terms to its neighbors. By the early 1500s, this power peaked under Rana Sanga. Rana Sanga was a veteran of countless battles, carrying 80 distinct scars, 1 eye, and a crippled arm. He used his reputation to do the impossible. He united the fractured Rajput clans into a single army. Facing a new invader from the north, Sanga invoked the Pati Parvan, a diplomatic call to arms that summoned kings and chieftains from across the region to form a unified coalition. In 1527, that coalition met the army of Babur at the Battle of Kanwa. Sanga had the advantage in numbers, but Babur brought a technology that rendered traditional Rajput tactics obsolete: heavy, gunpowder-based artillery.
Babur used a tactic called the Tulguma. While the Rajput army prepared for a head-on charge, Babur's mobile cavalry swept around their flanks, trapping the larger force in a tightening circle. With the Rajput army pinned, Babur's artillerists opened fire. The combination of flanking cavalry and cannon fire shattered the center of Sanga's formation, causing the coalition to dissolve. The defeat at Kanwa proved that stone walls and traditional courage were no longer enough. The arrival of artillery had changed the mechanics of war, and Mewar's old ways of defending itself were now a liability. Sanga died shortly after the battle, and without his leadership, the kingdom fell into chaos. In 1535, the Sultan of Gujarat took advantage of this weakness to sack Chittorgarh a second time, forcing the defenders into another desperate Saka. Internal assassinations followed. A usurper named Banvir seized the throne and eventually moved to murder the last infant heir of the royal line, the young prince Uday Singh. The prince's nurse, Pana Dai, discovered the plot. To save the heir, she placed her own son in the prince's bed, watching as the usurper murdered her child. She then smuggled Uday Singh out of the fort in a fruit basket, fleeing deep into the safety of the mountains. Mewar survived this era not because of its generals, but because its citizens were willing to sacrifice their own families to protect the idea of an independent kingdom. When Uday Singh reached adulthood, he faced the Mughal emperor Akbar. In 1567, Akbar brought a massive siege train to Chittorgarh,
using a musket named Sangram to personally pick off the fort's commanders. The walls were breached once again, but this time the king survived. Uday Singh had realized that in an age of heavy cannons, staying inside a fixed fortress was a guaranteed death sentence. He abandoned the exposed plains of Chittorgarh and moved his entire military operation into the Aravalli Mountains. The rocky, vertical terrain made it almost impossible for the Mughals to transport their heavy cannons or maintain a standard line of battle. He established his new headquarters at Kumbhalgarh. Unlike the flat plateau of Chittor, these walls were built to follow the jagged ridges of the mountains, making the fortress a natural extension of the cliffside. Finally, he founded the city of Udaipur. Instead of relying on stone walls alone, the new capital was protected by a network of deep lakes and steep hills, using the natural landscape to trap any invading force that tried to enter. Uday Singh saved the kingdom by recognizing that Mewar existed wherever its people could fight, not just within the walls of a single fort. Moving the government to the hills gave them a mobility the Mughals couldn't match, creating the exact tactical advantage his son, Maharana Pratap, would use to resist the empire for the rest of his life.